Tonight, we are not going to talk about a gentle kind of power. We are not going to talk about the oracle behind the silk curtain, or the mirror held in careful hands over the brazier, or the frequency in the pre-dawn dark of the inner chamber. That kind of power is real, and it is ancient, and it has its own beauty. But it is not what tonight is about. Tonight is about a different kind of power entirely. The kind that arrives on horseback. The kind that wears iron and gold, and does not wait behind a curtain for the world to come to it. The kind that goes out into the world and takes what it has decided belongs to it, and is correct often enough, and wrong often enough, and human enough in both, that the story of it is still worth telling 15 centuries after the person who embodied it closed his eyes for the last time on the Yamato plain. His name was Wakatakeru, young and fierce, the name itself a statement. Not the name of an oracle, not the name of a bridge between the worlds, the name of someone who intended to be felt. We are going back, further than the Yamatai, further than the oracle and the 1,000 maidens and the great queen who spoke to the gods so that no one else had to. We are going to the 5th century, to the era that the Chinese chronicles call the age of the 5 kings of Wa, to the era when the Yamato polity had grown large enough and complex enough and militarily capable enough that it was sending formal delegations to the most powerful empire in East Asia and asking, in the careful diplomatic language of the continental court, to be recognized. Not as a peripheral curiosity, as a power. If this journey helps you find rest tonight, please feel free to like the video and subscribe. It lets me know that this work is reaching someone. And leave a comment. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what time it is. It is strangely comforting to know that somewhere, in the quiet of another person's night, someone else is drifting toward the same ancient and patient dark. Close your eyes now. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift. Not all at once, the way the tide goes out. Slowly. Pulling back from the shore of your awareness, retreating by degrees, leaving behind the particular, clean smell of wet sand and the silence of a beach after the water has withdrawn. Your breathing is already slower. Good. The modern world is behind you now. Its lights and its noise and its insistence that everything is urgent, everything is immediate, everything requires your attention right now. All of it falling away, like the bark of an old cedar, peeling slowly in long, quiet strips onto the dark forest floor. You are standing on the Yamato plain, the 5th century now. And something about this plain is different from the plain of the 3rd century, from the era of the oracle and the silk curtains and the bone held over the fire. The difference is not in the smell of the soil, which is the same mineral, rain-wet, ancient smell it has always been. It is not in the mountains on the horizon, which are the same patient, geological shapes they have always been. It is not even in the wind, which is moving through the silver grass with the same slow, hypnotic hiss it has always moved with. The difference is in the scale of the human marks on the landscape. Shh. Shh. Look at the horizon. Not the natural horizon of the mountains, the horizon of the mounds. They are everywhere now. Not just the modest earthworks of the early Kofun period, the small, deliberate keystones of the Makimuku network, the great mounds, the enormous, three-moated, Haniwa-watched, decades of construction mounds that the middle Kofun period has been building across the Kawachi Plain and the Mozu coast and the river terraces of the expanding network. Their profiles are visible from here, in every direction, rising above the flat of the plain with the specific, unmistakable authority of things that were built to be seen from exactly this distance. This is a different world from the one that Io inhabited. 2 centuries have passed since the girl sat in the inner chamber with the 5 mirrors in their lacquered boxes and the lamp burning low in the corner. 2 centuries of accumulation, of the network expanding and the administration developing, and the continental knowledge arriving in the hands of the craftspeople and the scholars who crossed the cold water. 2 centuries of the mounds getting larger and the iron getting more plentiful, and the horse becoming the ordinary vehicle of the elite rather than the exotic technology of the very few. The world is bigger now, louder, more complicated, more capable of the kind of organized, sustained, large-scale action that builds a 486-meter mound on the Mozu Plain and sends a formal diplomatic delegation to the Liu-Song court in China with a letter that begins, "The King of Wa, greatly devoted to the Kingdom of the East." Inhale. And the 5th century fills the lungs. Exhale. And the plain settles into its new scale. And into this world, in the middle of the 5th century, a boy is born. Not an ordinary boy, though no one is ordinary who is born into the specific circumstances of the Yamato royal family in the middle Kofun period. A boy who will become, through a process that involves survival as much as inheritance, the king whose name appears on the iron of burial swords at both ends of the archipelago. The king whose diplomatic correspondence with the continent is more assertive than any of his predecessors. The king whose authority the tributary chiefs acknowledge with a specificity that the earlier, more oracle-based forms of Yamato power never quite achieved. A boy who will be called, when he is old enough to have earned the name, Wakatakeru, young and fierce. But right now, he is just a boy, in a palace on the Yamato plain, in a world that is larger and more dangerous and more politically complicated than the world of the oracle tradition that preceded him. In a world that will ask of him not the ability to be still and empty and receptive, not the quality of the mirror that holds itself open to whatever light arrives, but something else entirely. The ability to move, to decide, to act, and bear the consequences of the action, and go on acting. The specific, earthbound, mortal, entirely unglamorous capability of a person who understands that the world does not wait for the oracle to finish her practice before it does what it intends to do. Thud, thud, thud. The sound is coming from the direction of the great mounds on the Kawachi Plain. The construction that never quite stops in this era, the continuous, sustained, always ongoing work of a political system expressing itself in the only medium large enough for what it needs to say. Earth, tamped clay, the mallet on the soil, again and again, in the rhythm that is the heartbeat of the Kofun period, and the sound beneath everything else in this world. But tonight, underneath the thud of the construction, something else, something quieter and more personal and more specifically human than the collective percussion of the great mound labour. The sound of a child breathing in a room in the Yamato Palace. A child who does not know yet what his name will be, who does not know yet what the world will ask of him, who is simply here in the 5th century on the Yamato plain, breathing, as all of us breathe, before we know what the breathing is for. Sink down into the 5th century plain, sink down into the mineral smell of the soil and the profiles of the great mounds on the horizon and the thud of the construction in the distance, and the quiet, particular, entirely ordinary breathing of a child in a room in the Yamato Palace. The history is beginning, not with a battle, not with a decree, with a breath, and the long, complicated, fierce, entirely human life that will follow from it. The world is waiting, and it is very, very patient. The Yamato Palace in the middle of the 5th century is not the palace of the oracle tradition. It is not the cedar-scented, silk-curtained, incense-heavy space of the inner chamber and the pre-dawn practice, and the 1,000 maidens breathing in synchronized rhythm. Those things still exist in their way, in the ritual dimensions of the court. But they are not the defining quality of this palace. The defining quality of this palace is something harder to name and easier to feel. It is the quality of a place where the political stakes are very high and everyone knows it. Scuff. Pause. Scuff. Listen to the footsteps in the outer corridors. They are not the deliberate, ritual footsteps of the maidens moving through the sacred space of the oracle's residence. They are different, more varied, some quick and purposeful, the footsteps of officials who have somewhere to be and are going there with the specific, forward-leaning urgency of people operating in a system that rewards effectiveness and punishes its absence. Some slow and careful, the footsteps of people who are thinking about where they are going before they take each step, who understand that in this particular palace, in this particular political moment, arriving in the wrong place at the wrong time can have consequences that the ritual structure of the oracle tradition did not produce. The palace of Wakatakeru's childhood is a place of factions, of competing interests, of the specific, complicated, entirely human politics of a royal family that has grown large enough and the stakes of its internal competition high enough that the relationships within it are not simply the relationships of a family. They are the relationships of a court, with everything that implies about loyalty and its limits, alliance and its costs, and the particular clarifying danger of being born close enough to the center of power that your existence is itself a political fact. He is young, perhaps 5, perhaps 6, old enough to be aware that the adults around him are moving through their days with a quality of attention that is different from ordinary attention. Old enough to notice that certain names, when spoken in certain combinations, produce a change in the quality of the room, a slight stiffening, a redirected gaze, the particular, careful stillness of people who have just heard something that requires them to recalibrate. not old enough to understand why. Inhale, and the palace breathes its complicated breath. Exhale, and the child is still. His mother is careful with him, not in the demonstrative way of someone performing carefulness for an audience, in the quiet, sustained, entirely serious way of someone who understands that careful is the correct mode of operation in the current environment, and has incorporated it so completely into her daily practice that it is no longer an effort, but simply the way she moves through the world. She teaches him things without calling them lessons. The specific cadence of a bow that communicates respect without communicating submission. The quality of silence that is attentive rather than absent. The difference between the footsteps that announce themselves and the footsteps that do not, and when each is appropriate. The art of being in a room without being the most visible thing in it. These are not the lessons of the oracle tradition. The oracle tradition teaches emptiness, receptivity, the specific, cultivated quality of a person who has made themselves available to whatever the spirit world chooses to transmit. These lessons are different. These are the lessons of survival in a political environment. The lessons of a mother who loves her child and understands, with the specific clarity of someone who has been watching the court for long enough to know how it works, that the quality most likely to keep him alive is not the quality most likely to make him powerful. Not yet. Not now. Now, the quality most likely to keep him alive is the quality of not being noticed. Creak. Settle. Creak. The palace at night. He lies in the dark of his room and listens to the palace settling into its nighttime configuration. The footsteps slowing. The voices in the outer corridors dropping to the lower, more private register of people speaking without the awareness of an audience. The particular, distributed sound of a large building releasing the tension of the day. The cedar timbers contracting in the cooling air with the series of small, almost inaudible creaks that he has been listening to since before he was old enough to know what they were. He has learned to read these sounds, not deliberately, the way a child learns anything that is consistently present in their environment, through immersion, through the accumulated experience of lying in the dark and listening, night after night, until the sounds have organized themselves in his awareness into a map of the palace's nighttime life. Who is still moving, and where? Which corridors are quiet, and which are not? The specific, identifying quality of different footsteps, which he can distinguish by now with the same confidence that he distinguishes faces. He is learning the palace, not as a place, as a system, as the specific, human, political, entirely complicated system of a court in the middle of the 5th century, with its factions and its alliances, and its careful footsteps, and its redirected gazes, and the names that produce a change in the quality of the room. He does not know yet that this learning will save his life. He is 5 or 6, and he does not think in those terms. He is simply here, in the dark, listening. The way children listen when the world around them is more complicated than they have the vocabulary to process, with the whole of their attention, without the analytical overlay that adults apply to everything. Simply receiving, simply present, simply here. The palace settles. The footsteps stop. The cedar is quiet, and the boy lies in the dark, listening to the silence, learning the shape of the world he has been born into. Several years pass. The boy grows. The lessons continue, the ones his mother teaches without calling them lessons, and the ones the palace teaches simply by being what it is. He learns to read the court the way a sailor learns to read the sea, not from a book, from being on it, from the accumulated experience of 1,000 crossings, each one adding something to the understanding that cannot be acquired any other way. And then the year comes that changes everything. It does not arrive with announcement. The significant years rarely do. It arrives as an accumulation of small events, each one individually manageable, collectively amounting to something that is not manageable at all. A death, then another, then the specific, clarifying moment when the pattern of the deaths becomes legible and the understanding arrives in the particular, cold, stomach-level way that certain understandings arrive, that this is not accident. This is policy. Thud, thud, thud. But different now. Closer. The chronicles record what happened in the flat, administrative language of official history. Succession disputes. Brothers killed. The political violence of a royal family resolving its internal competition in the only way that royal families in this era have available to them when the competition becomes acute enough. The language is careful. The language is always careful in the official chronicles, which are written by people who serve the court and understand that the court's history of itself is a political document as much as a historical one. But underneath the careful language, the fact. In the years around Wakatakeru's adolescence, several of his brothers die. Not in battle, not from illness. In the specific, targeted, politically motivated way that people die when someone with sufficient power and sufficient motivation has decided that their continued existence is inconvenient. He understands this. Not immediately. Not with the fully formed analytical clarity that the adult looking back at these events can bring to them, but with the particular, pre-verbal understanding of a young person who has been learning to read the palace for years, and who now, watching the pattern of the deaths, understands in his body, before he understands in his mind, that the lesson his mother taught him, the lesson of not being noticed, has moved from the category of useful to the category of essential. Scuff. Stop. Silence. There is a moment. The chronicles do not record it, because the chronicles record events and not moments, and this is a moment rather than an event. A moment in which he is in a corridor, and footsteps are approaching from the direction he is not expecting, and the quality of those footsteps is the quality he has learned to associate with purposeful movement toward a specific destination, rather than movement through the palace on ordinary business. He steps into the shadow of a doorway, not dramatically, not with the theatrical urgency of someone who believes they are in a story, with the quiet, unhurried, entirely practical movement of someone who has been practicing not being noticed for long enough that the practice has become instinct. The footsteps pass. He breathes. He waits until the sound has gone entirely, until the corridor has returned to the specific quality of emptiness that means the movement through it has completed. Then he continues on his way. He does not know if those footsteps were looking for him. He does not know if the shadow of the doorway was necessary or merely cautious. He will never know. This is the condition of living in a political environment at a certain level of danger. The actions that keep you safe are invisible by definition, because if they were visible, they would not keep you safe. The danger you avoid leaves no record. Only the danger you don't avoid leaves a record, and that record is brief. Inhale, and the survival continues. Exhale, and the years accumulate. His mother is still careful, more careful now. The quality of her carefulness has changed slightly, the way the quality of the wind changes when the weather is about to shift. The same fundamental movement, the same essential direction, but a different density to it, a different weight. She speaks to him in shorter sentences now, more directly, as if the time for the lessons that are not called lessons has passed, and what is required now is the simpler, more urgent vocabulary of someone transmitting what is most important in the time available. She tells him, be patient. She tells him, be small. She tells him, the person who survives is not always the person who acts first. Sometimes it is the person who acts last. The person who is still there when everyone else has made their move and the board has cleared enough to see what is actually possible. He listens. He is good at listening. He has been practicing listening since before he knew he was practicing it. Since the nights in the dark, reading the map of the palace's footsteps. Since the corridors, learning the quality of purposeful movement. Since the redirected gazes and the careful stiffening and all the small, distributed lessons of a childhood spent in a court where the political stakes are high enough to kill. He is patient. He is small. He is still there when others are not. And the board is beginning to clear. The clearing of the board is not a clean process. Nothing in the politics of the 5th century Yamato court is clean. The chronicles record succession disputes and the deaths of rivals and the consolidation of power in language that is always somewhat cleaner than the reality it describes. Because the reality of political violence is never as orderly as the record makes it appear. But the outcome, eventually, is clear enough. The competition narrows. The field of potential claimants reduces itself through the specific, brutal arithmetic of the succession dispute to fewer and fewer. And the one who remains, the one who has been patient and small and present when the others were not, is the one who will become the king. He is not yet the king, not yet Wakatakeru. He is still a young man, in his late teens or early 20s, navigating the final stages of a competition that has been running since before he was old enough to understand it. But he can feel the shape of what is coming. The way you can feel the shape of a room in the dark when you have been in it long enough. Not seeing it, knowing it. Scuff. The corridor. A different quality now. The footsteps in the outer corridors are different these days. Not the careful, faction-navigating footsteps of the palace at peak political tension. Something is shifting. The quality of the movement through the palace is beginning to reorganize itself, the way a flock of birds reorganizes its collective direction when a new center of gravity has been established. Gradually, without announcement, but unmistakably to anyone who has been reading the map of the palace's movement long enough to notice the difference. They are beginning to orient toward him. This is new. This is the thing that the years of practice, the years of carefulness and smallness and patient observation did not prepare him for. Being noticed was the danger. Being noticed was what his mother taught him to avoid. And now the court is beginning to notice him not as a liability, but as a center. Not as a political risk to be managed, but as the political fact around which the management will organize itself. He is not sure how to be this, or he is not sure yet. He will learn. He has always learned by being in the thing rather than by studying it from a distance. The palace taught him that. The dark corridors and the careful footsteps and the shadow of the doorway taught him that. You learn the sea by being on it. Inhale, and the new gravity settles. Exhale, and the court reorganizes. But something has changed in him too. Something that the years of survival have produced that he did not have before and cannot now set aside even if he wanted to. The years of being small, of reading the room, of understanding the palace as a system of competing interests and careful footsteps and redirected gazes have produced in him a specific, permanent, entirely personal understanding of how power works. Not the way the oracle understands power, not as a frequency, not as the quality of being empty enough to receive what the spirit world transmits, as a system, as a network of relationships, each one maintained by the specific, continuous, entirely practical work of understanding what the other person needs, and whether you can provide it, and what providing it will cost, and whether the cost is worth the relationship. He understands people, not in the warm, empathetic sense, in the cold, precise, entirely accurate sense of someone who has been reading people for survival since childhood, and who has developed, through that reading, a capability that is more useful than empathy in the specific environment he inhabits. He knows what people want. He knows what they fear. He knows, with the particular, pre-verbal certainty of someone whose life has depended on this knowledge, the difference between the person who will hold under pressure and the person who will not. The difference between the alliance that is genuine and the alliance that is convenient. The difference between the footstep that is going where it says it is going and the footstep that is not. This is what survived. Not just the person, the capability, the specific, hard-won, entirely practical understanding of a court that has been in competition with itself for long enough that its internal dynamics have become legible to anyone patient enough to read them. Wakatakeru is not yet king, but he is already, in the ways that matter most in the world he inhabits, the person who will be. The court is orienting. The board has cleared enough. And the young man who learned to be small is beginning, quietly and without announcement, to become large. Thud, thud, thud. The construction on the Kawachi plain. The mounds still rising. The world still building itself. Patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the specific human drama of the succession. But the succession is almost complete, and the person it will produce is someone the world has not quite seen before. Someone who learned power the hard way, in the dark, in the corridors, in the shadow of a doorway, breathing quietly, waiting for the footsteps to pass. Good night. Just breathe. The board is clearing. The court is orienting. and the young man is learning what it means to be the thing that everything else is beginning to move toward. The throne does not arrive with ceremony. Or it does, technically. There are rituals. There are the formal protocols of the succession, the specific sequence of acknowledgements and declarations, and the presentation of the objects of authority that the tradition requires. The mirror, the sword, the jewel, the three treasures that have been the material vocabulary of Yamato royal legitimacy since before anyone currently alive can remember. But the ceremony is not the arrival. The ceremony is the announcement of something that has already happened. The political fact of the succession was established in the corridors and the redirected gazes and the clearing of the board, in the patient, unglamorous, entirely practical work of survival and positioning that preceded the ceremony by years. The ceremony simply makes the fact visible, translates it from the language of the court, which is subtle and indirect, and readable only to those who have been in the palace long enough to learn its grammar, into the language of the network, which needs something more explicit. He is the king now, Wakatakeru. The name is his now, in the full sense. Not the name his mother gave him, or the name the court used in its careful, faction-navigating way during the years of the succession dispute. The name in the full, political, cosmological weight of what a Yamato king's name carries. The concentration of authority and relationship, and the specific, accumulated meaning of a person who now stands at the center of a network that extends from the Kanto Plain to the Kumamoto Valley. Scuff. The morning footsteps of the court. The court is moving differently today. Not dramatically differently. The footsteps are still the footsteps of the same people, moving through the same corridors, doing the same daily work of the palace administration. But the quality of the movement has changed. The orientation has completed itself. What was beginning to organize around him in the final months of the succession is now fully organized. The flock has found its new direction. The river has found its new channel. Everything is moving toward him now. This is the thing he was not prepared for. Not the responsibility exactly. He has been preparing for responsibility in the specific, practical way that someone who has been watching a political system for their entire life prepares for responsibility, by understanding it from the inside before they are required to exercise it from the outside. He knows what the king does. He has been watching kings his entire life. What he was not prepared for is the quality of the attention, the specific, continuous, entirely unrelenting quality of being the point toward which everything else orients. The requests that arrive through the silk curtain, through the brother, through the formal channels of the court administration, each one addressed to him, each one requiring something from him, each one adding its small weight to the accumulated total of what the center of the network is expected to carry. Inhale, and the weight settles onto the shoulders. Exhale, and the king adjusts. He sits in the reception hall in the morning, not behind a silk curtain. He is not an oracle. The silk curtain is the technology of a different kind of authority, the spiritual authority of the bridge between the worlds, and he has not inherited that authority in the form that Himiko and Io practiced it. He has inherited it in a different form, the form that the Middle Kofun period has been developing over the 2 centuries since Io's reign, the form that supplements the spiritual legitimacy of the tradition with the earthbound legitimacy of the sword and the horse and the iron network of the expanding polity. He is visible. This is one of the first things that is different. The oracle was not visible. The oracle spoke through the brother from behind the curtain, and was known to the network through the quality of the decisions, rather than the presence of the person. He is visible. The officials who come to deliver their reports look at him directly. The tributary representatives who make their seasonal visits stand in his presence, rather than the presence of an intermediary. The continental delegations that arrive from the peninsula and from the Liu Song court beyond it are received by him, in person, in the formal language of continental diplomacy that requires the two parties to occupy the same physical space. He is the center, and the center is present. This takes adjustment. The years of being small, of not being the most visible thing in the room, of reading the room rather than being read by it, have produced habits that the kingship does not require, and occasionally contradicts. The habit of the doorway shadow is not available to a king. The habit of the careful footstep that does not announce itself is not available to a king whose footstep announces itself automatically, by virtue of what he is, before he has taken it. He is learning to be large, the way he learned everything, by being in it. Thud, thud, thud. The construction on the plain, still building, always building. In the afternoon, he walks to the edge of the compound and looks out at the plain. The mounds on the horizon, the great keyhole shapes of the middle Kofun period, built by his predecessors, saying what they were built to say about the center and the network and the scale of the political system that produced them. He looks at them for a long time. He is thinking about what his mound will say. Not morbidly, practically. The mound is part of the political vocabulary of the Yamato king. It is the statement that outlasts the king, the permanent, tamped clay declaration of what the reign was and what the network encompassed, and how large the center was willing to claim itself to be. His predecessors made their statements. He will make his. But that is later. That is the statement at the end. Right now, in the morning of the reign, the statement being made is this one. The footsteps in the corridor. The visible king in the reception hall. The weight of the network orienting itself toward a new center. And the new center learning, one morning at a time, what it means to carry that weight without being crushed by it. He breathes in, out. The plain is wide. The mounds are patient. The network is waiting. He turns and walks back into the palace. The chronicles describe him in terms that later readers have found uncomfortable. Not the official chronicles, which are careful with their language, in the way that official chronicles are always careful. The other records, the stories that circulate in the court and find their way into the literary traditions of the following centuries. The accounts that describe him as fierce, as quick to anger, as capable of a violence that the oracle tradition, with its emphasis on the quality of stillness and receptivity, did not produce in its leaders. He kills people. This is the historical fact beneath the literary accounts. Not in battle, necessarily, though battle is part of what a Middle Kofun king does. In the more personal, more direct, more immediately political way of someone who has decided that a specific person's continued existence is inconvenient and has the power to act on that decision. He is not the first Yamato king to kill people. The board that cleared before his succession did not clear by accident. But he is, in the accounts that survive, one of the more personally involved in the killing. Not delegating it entirely to the administrative apparatus of the court, present in it, immediate. Scuff. The court adjusts to this. This frightens some people. It is supposed to frighten some people. Fear, in the political vocabulary of the 5th century, is not simply an emotion to be managed. It is a tool. A specific, deployable, politically functional tool that a king who understands power as a system of relationships can use with the same deliberateness that he uses any other tool available to him. The king who is feared is the king who does not have to act very often. The threat implicit in the established willingness to act is itself a form of action, more efficient in many cases than the action itself. The king who killed the brothers is a king whose court knows, in the specific, embodied way that the court always knows things it has not been told explicitly, that the line between alliance and liability is a line the king can and will enforce. But there is something else in the accounts, something that sits alongside the fierceness and complicates the simple picture of a violent king. The accounts also describe him as generous to those he trusts, to the craftspeople and the scholars who come from the continent with their knowledge, to the poets, because there are poets at the Yamato court now, in the 5th century, and the king who will be remembered in the chronicles as fierce is also the king who will be remembered in the poetry collections as someone who understood the specific, human, entirely non-political value of a well-made poem. Inhale, and the complexity breathes. Exhale, and the person emerges from the king. He is not a simple person. Simple people do not survive the kind of childhood he survived. The court that produces a survivor of a succession dispute as brutal as the one he navigated does not produce simplicity. It produces someone who has learned to hold multiple things simultaneously, the fierce and the careful, the visible king and the person who learned to be invisible, the person who kills and the person who listens to poems. This is the quality that makes him difficult to categorize in the chronicles and in the historical memory of the following centuries. He is not the oracle, the spiritual bridge, the empty vessel for the divine. He is not simply the warrior king, the mounted, iron-wielding, purely earthbound authority of the military tradition. He is something in between those two things, and also something beyond both of them. The specific, complicated, historically particular person who happened to be the Yamato king in the middle of the 5th century, and who dealt with the specific challenges of that specific moment, with the specific capabilities he had developed in the specific circumstances of his specific life. Thud. The court moves around him. He is learning the difference between the fear that is useful and the fear that is not. The fear that organizes the court around his authority is useful. The fear that prevents the court from telling him what he needs to know is not. A king who is only feared receives only the information that people think he he wants to receive. A king who is only feared is a king who does not know what is actually happening in his own network. He needs both things. The fear that establishes the boundary of what is acceptable, and the trust that allows the information to flow. The challenge of holding both simultaneously, of being the kind of person who inspires both, is the central challenge of the reign in its early years. He is working on it, one morning at a time, one reception at a time, one decision at a time, each one calibrated against the double requirement of maintaining the authority and maintaining the information, the fierce and the careful, both necessary, both his. Months pass, then a year, then several years. The network is learning him the way a river learns a new channel. Not immediately, not all at once. Through the accumulated experience of water finding the path of least resistance, which, in the political vocabulary of the network, means the tributary chiefs learning, through the accumulated experience of their interactions with the new king, what the new king rewards and what he does not. He rewards competence. This is the first thing the network learns. The tributary chiefs who deliver their reports accurately, who maintain their roads and their grain stores and their relationships with the communities under their authority, who fulfill the obligations of the network without requiring the center to remind them of those obligations, receive from the new king the specific, practical, entirely desirable reward of being left alone to do their work. No interference, no additional demands. The autonomy that is the most valuable thing the center can offer to a competent periphery. He does not reward incompetence. This is the second thing the network learns. The chief whose grain stores are misrepresented, whose road maintenance is performed only when the king's inspectors are expected, whose tributary obligations are fulfilled in letter but not in spirit, encounters a different quality of attention from the center, a more direct attention, a more personal attention. The specific, focused, entirely unambiguous attention of a king who has been reading political systems since childhood, and who knows, with the particular, pre-verbal certainty of someone whose life depended on this knowledge, the difference between a tributary relationship that is genuine and one that is convenient. Scuff. The seasonal messengers arriving from the provinces. The messengers are reading him too. Every encounter between the provincial representatives and the center is a transmission of information in both directions. The messengers are delivering reports and tribute, and the seasonal acknowledgements of the tributary relationship. But they are also observing, reading the quality of the reception, assessing the mood of the court, the state of the king's attention, the specific, contextual information about what kind of center the new king is running and what it will require of the network going forward. They carry this information back to their chiefs, who incorporate it into their assessment of the relationship, who adjust their behavior accordingly, who are, in the specific, practical, entirely unsentimental way of political actors, operating in a system of incentives and consequences, learning what the new king rewards and what he does not, and calibrating their performance to the discovered reality of his expectations. The network and the king are learning each other simultaneously. through the medium of the seasonal interactions and the tributary exchanges, and the formal receptions, and the informal observations of the messengers who move between the center and the periphery, carrying information in both directions. Inhale, and the learning deepens. Exhale, and the network stabilizes. He is becoming legible to the network. This is what he wanted. Not the legibility of the oracle, whose authority derived precisely from its inscrutability, from the quality of the divine that cannot be fully comprehended by the human. The legibility of the king, the specific, practical, politically functional legibility of a center whose expectations are known, and whose responses to the fulfillment or non-fulfillment of those expectations are predictable. Predictable is not the same as safe. He is not trying to be safe. Safe is not a political category he has much interest in. Predictable means the network knows what will happen if it does this. The network knows what will happen if it does that. The network can make rational calculations about the costs and benefits of its various options, because the king is consistent enough that those calculations are worth making. A consistent king is a king whose network can function, because the network needs to know the rules in order to operate within them. And a network that can function is a network that generates the grain and the labor and the military capability and the continental access that the center needs to maintain itself. This is not sentiment. This is the political economy of the Yamato polity in the middle of the 5th century, understood from the inside by a king who has been studying it since childhood, and who is now, in the early years of his reign, applying what he learned to the specific, practical, daily work of running the largest political system in the archipelago. The network is learning its king, and the king is learning that being known is not the same as being vulnerable, that the legibility he spent his childhood avoiding is, from the center of the network, not a liability, but a resource. The resource of being the predictable, consistent, entirely serious fact around which everything else can organize itself. The throne has settled onto his shoulders. Not comfortably. It was never going to be comfortable, but correctly. The weight distributed in the specific, sustainable way of something that has found its proper position and intends to stay there. Good night. Just breathe. The network is learning. The king is learning. And the plain is patient outside the palace walls, wide and mineral, and entirely indifferent to the human drama of the court, holding everything in its usual, reliable, ancient way. There is a room in the Yamato palace that everyone knows about and no one mentions. Not because it is secret exactly, because mentioning it is itself a kind of acknowledgement, and acknowledgement of certain things in certain political environments is a form of vulnerability that the people of the court have learned, through the accumulated experience of living in this particular palace under this particular king, to avoid. The room is not remarkable to look at. Cedar walls, rush mats, the same oil lamp in the corner that every room in the palace has, the same smell of old wood and the particular, slightly smoky quality of air that has been circulating through a large building for a long time. Nothing about the room announces what it is. What it is the room where the decisions are made that are not made anywhere else. Scuff. The corridor outside. Careful footsteps. Slower than usual. He uses it in the early morning, before the formal business of the court begins, before the officials arrive with their reports, and the messengers with their provincial updates, and the tributary representatives with their seasonal acknowledgements. In the specific, quiet window between the pre-dawn dark and the full light of the morning, when the palace is between its nighttime and its daytime configurations, and the corridors are empty enough that a conversation in a room can remain a conversation in a room, rather than becoming a piece of information travelling through the court. The people who come to this room in the early morning are not the senior officials of the formal administration. They are different people. The ones whose roles are not recorded in the official documents of the court, whose names appear in the administrative records, if they appear at all, in the indirect language of people who exist at the edge of the formal structure, rather than within it. The ones who move through the network in ways that the network's formal channels do not accommodate. He listens to them with the same quality of attention he brings to everything. The full, patient, pre-verbal attention of someone who has been reading people for survival since childhood, and who has developed, through that reading, the specific capability of hearing what is being said beneath what is being said. The information beneath the information. The concern that the speaker cannot quite bring themselves to state directly, but that is present in the quality of the pauses and the specific words chosen, and the particular, almost imperceptible quality of the breathing that changes when a person is saying something important. Inhale, and the information arrives. Exhale, and the assessment forms. The network has fissures. This is what the early morning room reveals, over the months and years of the reign's consolidation. The network has fissures that the formal reports do not describe, and the seasonal messengers do not mention, because the formal reports and the seasonal messengers are produced by the people who have the most to lose from the fissures being known. The tributary chiefs whose grain stores are misrepresented, the regional administrators whose road maintenance exists primarily on paper, the alliances between provincial powers that are conducted without the knowledge of the centre, and that constitute, in the political vocabulary of the era, the early stages of the kind of coordination that precedes the kind of challenge that a king in the middle of a succession dispute is familiar with from the inside. He knows what coordination looks like. He has been part of it, in a different form, in the years before his reign. He knows the specific, distributed, individually innocent-seeming quality of a set of relationships that are building towards something. He knows the difference between the tributary chief who is communicating with his neighbor about the harvest and the tributary chief who is communicating with his neighbor about the center. He acts, not immediately, not dramatically, with the specific, patient, entirely deliberate timing of someone who has learned that acting too early reveals your knowledge, and acting too late reveals your weakness, and that the window between those two errors is where all the real decisions live. Thud. Deliberate. Measured. The sound of consequence arriving. The accounts in the chronicles describe what follows in language that is careful and sometimes indirect, but whose meaning is not ambiguous to anyone reading it with the understanding of the political context. Chiefs who were building the wrong kind of coordination are no longer building it. Not because they were persuaded, because the specific, personal, entirely unambiguous attention of the king arrived in their province before their coordination was complete enough to resist it. The network is being clarified. This is the word he would use, if he used words for it. which he does not. He does not explain himself to the court. He acts, and the court observes the action and draws the conclusions that the action was designed to produce. The conclusions are the message. The explanation would diminish the message by suggesting that it required explanation. The court is learning something specific about this king. Not just that he acts before you expect him to. That the window between knowing and acting, which in other political systems is a window of opportunity for the person being known about, is in this court a window that closes faster than you can use it. Fear, properly deployed, is a form of efficiency. This is not cruelty, or it is not only cruelty. It is the specific, political, entirely rational understanding of a person who has studied power as a system and who knows that the system runs more smoothly when the cost of defection is high enough that defection is not worth calculating. The room in the early morning, the people whose names are not in the records, the information beneath the information, the timing that arrives before the coordination is complete. This is the architecture of fear, built not from violence alone, but from the specific, calibrated, entirely deliberate combination of knowledge and timing and consequence that makes the violence rarely necessary, because the threat of it is always present. He breathes in the early morning air of the room, cedar and lamp smoke, and the particular mineral cold of the pre-dawn palace. He breathes out. The court is learning. The network is clarifying. And the architecture is holding. But fear alone does not run a network of this size. This is the thing that the architecture of fear, for all its efficiency, cannot do by itself. A network held together by fear is a network that is always one calculation away from the moment when the fear is outweighed by the alternative. The chief who is terrified of the king is also, always, performing the calculation of whether the terror is worth the tribute, whether the cost of the relationship exceeds the cost of challenging it. He knows this. He has been performing this calculation himself in different forms since childhood. The calculation of whether staying small is still the better option, or whether the moment has arrived when the board has cleared enough that acting is worth the risk. He knows, from the inside, that the calculation is always running, that the fear is never sufficient by itself, that what keeps the calculation from resolving in the wrong direction is not more fear, but something else. Something that makes the relationship worth having, regardless of the fear. Scuff. Different footsteps now. The ones he trusts. The craftspeople arrive from the continent in the middle years of his reign. Not the first wave of continental immigrants, which preceded his birth by decades. This wave is different, more specifically recruited, more deliberately sought. The product of a court that has been developing through the continental diplomatic relationships that his predecessors cultivated and that he is actively expanding. The specific capability to identify and attract the knowledge that the Yamato network needs and does not yet have. The potters who know the Su-ware technique at its highest level. The ironworkers whose knowledge of the continental forging tradition goes beyond what the first-generation immigrants transmitted. The textile workers whose silk technique is more refined than what the archipelago has been producing. The scholars, the ones who carry in their minds the Chinese writing system and the continental administrative models, and the accumulated knowledge of a bureaucratic tradition that is older and more developed than anything the archipelago has independently produced. He receives them differently from the way the court receives the tributary chiefs, without the architecture of fear, with the specific, genuine, entirely practical generosity of a person who understands that knowledge cannot be compelled, that the craftsperson who is afraid of the king produces what they produce out of fear, which is adequate. But the craftsperson who trusts the king produces what they produce out of the fullness of their capability, which is more than adequate, which is, in the specific cases of the knowledge the continental immigrants carry, something the Yamato network cannot get any other way. Inhale, and the generosity settles. Exhale, and the trust builds. He sits with the scholars in the afternoon. Not the formal afternoon of the court reception, with its protocol and its silk robes and its carefully calibrated hierarchy of acknowledgement. The informal afternoon. The specific, unglamorous, entirely practical afternoon of a person who wants to understand something and has found someone who can explain it and has decided that the explanation is worth the time. The writing system. The continental administrative models. The specific, practical application of the Chinese bureaucratic tradition to the specific, particular, historically unique situation of the Yamato polity in the middle of the 5th century. He is not interested in the writing system as an intellectual achievement. He is interested in it as a tool. The specific, practical, entirely functional tool of an administrative apparatus that needs to coordinate activity across a territory too large and too complex to be coordinated through the oral transmission of information alone. The scholar explains. He listens. He asks questions that reveal to the scholar that he has been listening not just to the words, but to the structure beneath the words, the administrative logic that the writing system makes possible. The scholar adjusts his explanation accordingly, gives more structure, less decoration. The specific, unadorned, technical explanation of how the thing works, rather than the presentation of the thing as an achievement. This is what he does with the people he trusts. He meets them where they actually are, not where the protocol of the court places them, not where the hierarchy of the network positions them, but where they actually are, in the specific, individual, entirely particular reality of a person who knows something and is capable of transmitting it. He is good at this. It surprises people, the ones who come to him with the expectation of the fierce king, and encounter instead the person who listened to the palace settling in the dark, who learned the map of the footsteps, who has been reading people since before he could name what reading was. It surprises them to be read accurately, to have what they know recognized before they have fully articulated it, to find in the fierce king the quality of attention that, in the oracle tradition, was attributed to the divine. It is not divine. It is practice. It is the accumulated capability of a lifetime of reading rooms and corridors, and the quality of pauses in conversations, and the specific, identifying characteristics of footsteps in the dark. But it produces trust, in the specific, practical, entirely real sense of people deciding that this person is worth giving their best to, rather than just their adequate, that the knowledge they carry is safe here, that the transmission is worth completing. The network of the trusted is smaller than the network of the afraid, but it is doing work that the network of the afraid cannot do. It is building the administrative capability, the craftwork knowledge, the continental connection that the Yamato polity needs to be what it is becoming. Something larger than the mound-building tradition alone can accommodate. Something that requires, alongside the tamped clay and the iron sword and the gold belt, the written record, the administrative document, the specific, practical, entirely unromantic technology of a bureaucracy that can coordinate activity across the full breadth of the archipelago. He breathes in the afternoon air of the scholar's room, cedar and ink, and the particular, dry smell of the writing materials. He breathes out. The trust is building. The knowledge is transmitting. And the network has more tools than fear. Several years into the reign, the court has learned him well enough that its daily operation has found a stable rhythm. Not comfortable exactly. Stable. The specific, sustainable stability of a system that has internalized its own rules thoroughly enough that the rules no longer need to be enforced moment by moment, but operate as the background conditions of the system's function. The officials know what he rewards. The tributary chiefs know what he requires. The scholars and craftspeople know what he values. The people in the early morning room know what he needs to know. The court has organized itself around the specific, discovered reality of this king in the way that courts always organize themselves around the specific, discovered reality of their kings. Through the accumulated experience of 1,000 interactions, each one adding something to the collective understanding of what this particular center requires and rewards and will not tolerate. But alongside it, the trust. The scholars and their ink, the craftspeople and their fires, the court that has found its rhythm, the network that is learning what it is capable of when it is functioning correctly. Both things, the fear and the trust, the fierce and the careful, the king who acts before you expect him to, and the king who listens longer than you expect him to. Both true, both his, both necessary for the specific, complicated, historically particular work of being Wakatakeru in the 5th century. Good night. Just breathe. The court is settling into its nighttime configuration. The footsteps are slowing. The corridors are quieting. And the king is in the room in the early morning. Not yet, but soon, waiting for the information to arrive and the day to begin again. And he has organized himself around the court. This is the thing that is less obvious. The exchange of learning has not been unidirectional. He has learned the court, while the court has learned him, has developed, through the daily practice of being the center of this specific system, a feel for its rhythms and its pressures, and the specific distributed intelligence of a network that is always, in its countless daily interactions, producing information that the center can use if the center is paying attention. Scuff. The morning begins. The rhythm holds. He is paying attention. This has not changed. The quality of attention that the dark corridors and the careful footsteps produced is still the fundamental operating mode. The throne has not replaced it with the performed authority of a king who has stopped needing to read the room because the room has been arranged to present only what the king wants to see. He has not arranged the room that way. He knows where that leads. He has watched it lead there, in the reigns that preceded his, in the political environments that produced the succession disputes he survived. The king who stops reading the room is the king whose network can build its coordination without being detected. He will not be that king. But the reading is different now, more fluent, less effortful. The way any practice becomes, after enough years of consistent application, something that happens below the level of conscious effort. The court is legible to him in the specific, automatic, pre-verbal way that the palace's nighttime sounds were legible to the child lying in the dark. He knows it the way he knows his own breathing. Inhale, and the court speaks. Exhale, and the king listens. There is a quality in the court now that was not there in the beginning, a quality that is difficult to name precisely, but that is present in the movement of the footsteps and the texture of the silences and the specific way that the officials carry themselves in the corridors of the palace. It is not just fear. Fear alone produces a different quality, a tighter, more defensive, more inward-facing quality of movement. This is something else, something that coexists with the fear and is not diminished by it, but is not reducible to it. It is the quality of a court that knows it is at the center of something real, something that is doing what it is supposed to do. The network is functioning, the grain is moving, the roads are maintained. The continental relationships are producing the knowledge and the iron and the prestige goods that the center needs. The administration is developing the capability to coordinate at the scale the polity requires. The swords at both ends of the archipelago carry the name of the king. The court knows all of this, not as an abstract political achievement, as the daily, practical, entirely concrete reality of a system that is working, of a center that is holding, of a king who is difficult and fierce and entirely serious and occasionally terrifying, and also, undeniably, running the largest and most capable political system the archipelago has produced. There is a pride in this, the specific, practical, entirely unsentimental pride of people who are part of something that is working and who know, from the inside, what it costs to make it work. The officials who deliver their accurate reports, the craftspeople who produce their best work, the scholars who transmit their knowledge completely, the people in the early morning room who provide the information beneath the information. All of them part of this. All of them, in their specific, particular, individual ways, contributing to the thing that the king at the center is building, and all of them knowing, in the specific, practical, body-level way that you know the things you are actually part of, that the thing being built is real. The court knows its king, and the king knows his court. And between the knowing, in the specific, daily, unglamorous, absolutely essential space of the mutual understanding, the Yamato polity is becoming what it is trying to become. The architecture of fear is still there. The room in the early morning is still there. The people whose names are not in the records are still moving through the network, gathering the information beneath the information. None of that has changed. The sea to the west of the archipelago is not a barrier. This is the thing that the modern imagination, accustomed to thinking of the ocean as the edge of the world, tends to get wrong about the 5th century. The Korea Strait is not a wall. It is a road. A cold, grey, sometimes dangerous road that requires specific knowledge and specific equipment, and the specific, accumulated seamanship of people who have been crossing it for generations. But a road nonetheless. A road that has been carrying people and goods and knowledge between the archipelago and the continent since long before the Kofun period, since long before the rice, since the deep prehistory of the islands, when the first people arrived from the mainland and brought with them everything they knew. By the 5th century, the road is busy. Creak, slap, creak. The sound of a hull on water. The ships that make this crossing are not large. Broad-beamed, shallow-drafted, propelled by paddle or sail, depending on the conditions, carrying their cargo in a hold that is perpetually damp with the spray of the strait. They are not comfortable. The crossing takes days in good conditions and is not attempted in bad ones. But they cross, season after season, carrying the specific, material, entirely practical evidence of a connection between the archipelago and the continent that is older than any political system currently operating on either shore. Wakatakeru knows this road. Not personally, not yet. Not in the physical sense of having made the crossing himself. He knows it the way a king knows the roads of his network, without walking every one of them. Through the information that travels along it. Through the craftspeople and scholars who arrived on it. Through the tributary relationships with the kingdoms of the Korean peninsula, whose products and whose knowledge have been changing the material life of the Yamato polity for generations. But he wants more from the road than it has been providing. Not more goods, exactly. More recognition. Inhale, and the ambition forms. Exhale, and the horizon extends. The Liu Song dynasty controls, in the 5th century, the most prestigious address in the East Asian political world. Not the most powerful, in the purely military sense, the most prestigious. The inheritor of the Han tradition, the continental empire whose administrative models and whose cultural achievements define, for the political world of 5th century East Asia, the standard against which other political entities measure themselves. To be recognized by the Liu Song is to be recognized in the only currency that the diplomatic world of the era universally accepts. His predecessors understood this. The 4 kings of Wa who preceded him in the Chronicles account of the 5 kings sent their delegations to the Liu Song court, sought the specific, formal, diplomatically encoded recognition that the continental imperial system offers to the peripheral powers who participate in its tributary framework. The recognition that says, you exist, you are real, you are a political entity of sufficient substance that the empire is willing to acknowledge your relationship to it in the formal language of the tributary system. The recognition matters. Not because the Liu Song can enforce anything in the archipelago, which it cannot. Because the tributary relationship is a statement made in the most legible political vocabulary of the era, addressed not just to the Liu Song, but to everyone who reads the Liu Song's records. To the kingdoms of the Korean peninsula, whose relationships with the Yamato polity are complex and contested, and require the Yamato to maintain a credible claim to regional significance. To the tributary chiefs of the network, who understand the continental relationship as confirmation of the centre's legitimacy. To the polity itself, whose understanding of its own position in the world is shaped by the recognition it receives from the most prestigious address on the horizon. He is going to write a letter, the most important letter the Yamato polity has ever sent. Scuff, the scholar's room, ink and cedar, and the specific smell of serious work. The composition is not simple. The letter must be written in the formal language of the Continental Court, which is not his language, and requires the specific, technical expertise of the scholars who arrived on the Western Road with the writing system in their minds. It must navigate the specific protocols of the tributary correspondence, the formal vocabulary of acknowledgement and request that the Liu Song Court expects from its peripheral correspondence. It must say what he wants to say, which is ambitious, in language that the court will receive as appropriate rather than presumptuous. He works on it with the scholars in the specific, unglamorous, ink-stained way that important documents are produced. Not dictating from the throne, sitting at the low writing table, the scholar beside him, the draft in front of them both, discussing the specific choice of characters, the specific formulation of the request, the specific balance between the deference that the tributary form requires and the assertion that his political ambitions demand. He is learning to write the continent's language. Not fluently, not yet, not in the sense of being able to produce the letter independently, but with enough understanding of its structure and its logic to know when the scholar's draft says what he wants it to say and when it does not. Thud, thud, thud. The polity behind the letter, giving it weight. The letter that emerges from this process is, by the standards of the Five Kings correspondence, remarkable. The earlier letters were modest, appropriately deferential, careful to stay within the boundaries of what a peripheral power can claim without overreaching. His letter is different. It claims a territory, specifically. In the formal language of the continental diplomatic system, it enumerates the provinces under his authority, the peoples who acknowledge his rule, the directions of the compass his network encompasses. It is not a modest letter. It is the letter of a king who has decided that modesty is not serving the purpose, and that the time has come to make the largest claim the diplomatic vocabulary can support. The letter crosses the water. On the same road that brought the craftspeople and the scholars, on the same cold, grey, creak and slap crossing of the Korea Strait that has been carrying the connection between the worlds since before either world was what it is now. It arrives at the Liu Song Court. It is read. The scholars of the Continental Court assess it in the specific, professional, entirely unsentimental way of scholars whose job it is to assess the claims of peripheral powers and determine how to respond. They discuss it. The emperor considers it, and the response comes back across the water. Inhale, and the response arrives. Exhale, and the recognition settles. The recognition is not everything he asked for. It is never everything you ask for in the diplomatic system of the era. The Continental Court gives what serves the continental interest, which is not always identical with what the peripheral power requests. But it is recognition. Formal. Specific. The acknowledgement that the King of Wa exists and has submitted the appropriate correspondence and has been received into the tributary framework of the Liu Song Court. He reads the response in the scholar's room, in the specific, quiet, ink and cedar air of the room where the letter was composed. He reads it without expression, which is the expression of someone who has learned to receive significant information without allowing the significance to show on his face before he has fully processed what it means. Then he puts it down. He sits for a moment. He breathes. The world has acknowledged him. Not completely, not on his terms, but it has acknowledged him. And acknowledgement in the political vocabulary of the era is the beginning of everything else. The letter that came back from the Liu Song court is not the only document that crosses the water in the reign of Wakatakeru. The diplomatic correspondence is ongoing. A sustained, carefully managed, entirely practical exchange of formal documents that constitutes, in the political economy of the era, the Yamato polity's primary interface with the continental world. But the letters are about more than recognition. The letters are about a specific, contested, politically explosive claim. The claim to authority over the Korean peninsula. This claim is not entirely invented. In the earlier centuries, the Yamato polity had genuine relationships with the kingdoms of the peninsula. Military relationships, tributary relationships. The specific, material connections of a political system that was drawing iron and knowledge and craftspeople from the peninsula and was providing, in exchange, the military presence and the political relationships that made those imports possible. The Yamato was not simply claiming the peninsula. It had been present on the peninsula, in various forms, for generations. But by the 5th century, the situation has changed. The kingdoms of the peninsula are stronger. Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the west, Silla in the east, each of them developing, through their own continental connections and their own internal political development, a capability and a confidence that the earlier, more compliant relationships with the Yamato did not require them to have. Scuff. The diplomatic dispatches from the peninsula. A different quality of information. He reads them in the early morning room. The people whose names are not in the records deliver them, along with their assessment of the political situation on the other side of the water. The assessment is not comfortable. The relationships are shifting. The tributary connections that his predecessors maintained with the peninsular kingdoms are fraying at their edges. The iron supply chain, which depends on those relationships, is not as secure as the formal reports suggest. The letter to the Liu Song court is partly about this. The claim to authority over the peninsular kingdoms, stated in the formal language of the continental tributary system, is an attempt to use the most prestigious address in the East Asian world to shore up a set of relationships that are showing signs of strain. If the Liu Song acknowledges the Yamato's authority over the peninsular kingdoms, then the peninsular kingdoms are, in the formal diplomatic language of the era, in a position of subordination to the Yamato that makes their current behavior illegitimate. It is a sophisticated move. The specific, calculated, entirely practical sophistication of a political actor who understands that the diplomatic vocabulary is itself a tool, that the form of the claim is as important as its content, and that the Continental Court's acknowledgement, even partial, is worth more in the political economy of the peninsular relationships than any military action the Yamato could currently mount. Inhale, and the calculation settles. Exhale, and the diplomacy continues. The Liu Song response to the peninsular claim is, as noted, not everything he asked for. The Continental Court is not interested in adjudicating the specific territorial disputes of the Eastern peripheral powers. It acknowledges what serves its purposes and declines to acknowledge what does not. The specific formulation of the recognition it grants is the formulation of a court that has been managing the competing claims of peripheral powers for a very long time, and has developed the specific, professional, entirely unsentimental capability to give each one enough to maintain the relationship without giving anyone enough to destabilize the regional balance. He accepts this, not because he is satisfied, because he understands the limits of the achievable and has decided that the achievable is worth taking. The recognition that the Liu Song grants is sufficient to make the diplomatic point, not sufficient to resolve the peninsular relationships, which will require a different kind of approach. Thud, thud, thud. The military preparation beginning. The military approach is not something he comes to quickly. He is not a king who confuses the desire to act with the readiness to act. The years in the corridors, the patient reading of the board, the understanding of the difference between the moment when acting is worth the risk and the moment when it is not. All of this informs his military thinking as much as it informs everything else. But the military dimension of the peninsular relationships is becoming unavoidable. The iron supply chain requires relationships that diplomatic correspondence alone cannot maintain. The continental connections that the craftspeople and scholars have established require a degree of security on the Western Road that the current political situation on the peninsula does not provide. The Yamato polity's claim to be a significant power in the East Asian world, made in the formal language of the Liu Song correspondence, requires a military capability that can back the claim in the situations where the diplomatic language is not sufficient. He is building that capability, not in the dramatic, campaign-by-campaign way of the Chronicle's accounts, which compress years of preparation into a narrative of events. In the patient, sustained, entirely unglamorous way that actual military capability is built. Through the iron supply, through the horse breeding, through the development of the administrative capability to mobilize and supply a force of sufficient size to project the Yamato's authority beyond the archipelago. The letters across the water are the public face of this work. The formal, diplomatic, carefully composed face that the Continental Court sees and that the tributary chiefs of the network read as confirmation of the centre's engagement with the larger world. The military preparation is the other face, the face that the early morning room sees, the face that the people whose names are not in the records report on, from the peninsula and from the intermediate points on the Western Road. Both faces are both are necessary. The letter and the iron, the formal recognition and the military capability, the diplomatic vocabulary and the physical fact of the force behind it. He is not choosing between them. He is building both, simultaneously, in the patient, sustained, unglamorous way that he builds everything. The horizon is not a wall. It is a road, and the road goes in both directions. The diplomatic relationship with the Liu Song is not only about what the Yamato sends west. It is also about what comes back east. The recognition, yes, the formal acknowledgement of the tributary correspondence, but also the material consequence of the relationship. The specific, practical, entirely concrete things that flow back along the Western Road in the wake of the diplomatic exchange. The continental gifts are not random. They are calibrated, each one a specific, deliberate choice by the Liu Song court, or by the intermediate kingdoms of the peninsula who participate in the exchange network, to send something that serves the relationship in a specific way. Objects that confirm the recognition. Objects that demonstrate the continental connection to the Yamato's own network. Objects that carry, in their continental manufacture and their continental style, the material evidence of a relationship that the tributary chiefs of the Yamato network can see and touch and understand as confirmation of the center's significance. Scuff. The tribute arrives from the Western Road. Bronze mirrors. Still, the same currency that flowed through the Yamato network in the era of Himiko and Io, still arriving from the continent in the forms that the continental workshops produce, still carrying in their engraved backs and their polished faces the specific, material evidence of a connection that the archipelago's own workshops can approximate, but not quite replicate. The continental mirror is still the continental mirror, still different from the local copy in the specific, subtle, entirely legible to the trained eye ways that the trained eye of the tributary chief can read as the difference between the real and the imitation. He distributes them through the network, the same way his predecessors distributed them, but with a different administrative precision. The writing system that the scholars have been transmitting, the administrative capability that the continental models have been developing, allows the distribution to be tracked and recorded in a way that the oral administration of the earlier period did not. Each mirror distributed is a documented exchange. Each documented exchange is a node in the administrative record of the tributary relationship. Each node in the administrative record is, potentially, a piece of evidence in the ongoing management of the network. Inhale, and the administration deepens. Exhale, and the network solidifies. But the mirrors are not what interests him most about what comes back from the continent. What interests him most is harder to hold in the hand, and harder to distribute through the network, and harder to track in the administrative record. It is the knowledge. The continental administrative models that the scholars carry in their minds are not static. They are developing. The Liu Song court is, in the 5th century, in the middle of its own administrative evolution, refining the bureaucratic structures and the legal frameworks and the specific, practical, technical vocabulary of governance that has been the continental tradition's great contribution to the political world of East Asia. The scholars who cross the water bring with them not just the knowledge of the earlier transmissions, but the updates, the current version, the specific contemporary understanding of how the continental administrative system works and what it is capable of. He absorbs this. In the afternoon sessions with the scholars, in the specific, unglamorous, ink-stained work of the writing table, in the early morning room, where the information the scholars provide about the continental administrative models is assessed alongside the information the people whose names are not in the records provide about the state of the network, and the two are combined into the specific, practical, entirely applied understanding of how the Yamato polity needs to develop to become what he is trying to make it. Thud, thud, thud. The administration building itself into the network. The documents are beginning. Not yet the fully developed documentary culture of the later periods, but beginning. The specific, halting, entirely significant beginning of a political system learning to use writing as a tool of governance, rather than just a tool of diplomatic correspondence. The administrative records that track the tributary obligations, the land registers that are starting to document the polity's direct resource base, the early versions of the formal communications between the centre and the provincial administration that will eventually become the documentary apparatus of the later court. He is building something that will outlast him. Not just the mound, the administrative structure, the bureaucratic capability, the specific, practical, entirely unglamorous infrastructure of a political system that can function at the scale the Yamato polity has reached and needs to reach further. The infrastructure that makes the network more than the sum of its tributary relationships, that makes it, slowly and without fanfare, a state. He does not use that word. The word is not available in his vocabulary in the form that later political science would use it, but the concept is present in the work, in the writing table, and the administrative records and the scholars who transmit the continental models and the documents that are beginning to track the network's resources and obligations with a precision that the oral administration of the oracle tradition could not achieve. The continent gave recognition. It gave mirrors and prestige goods and the formal vocabulary of the tributary system. But what it gave that matters most in the long run of the historical record is this: the administrative knowledge, the writing system, the specific, technical, entirely practical capability to organize a political system at a scale that the oral tradition alone cannot manage. He used it in the patient, sustained, unglamorous way he uses everything, building the capability, developing the infrastructure, making the polity one document and one administrative record and one continental model absorbed and applied into something that can carry the name inscribed on the iron of the distant swords and bear the weight of what that name implies. The letters across the water brought the world's acknowledgement. The knowledge the world sent back is building the capacity to deserve it. Good night. Just breathe. The Western Road is quiet tonight. The ships are in their harbours. The scholars are sleeping. And the documents are in their cedar boxes, keeping faith with the administrative reality they record. Patient, precise, permanent. The new language of the Yamato polity, learning to say in writing what it has always been saying in earth. Iron is not romantic. This is the first thing to understand about the 5th century Yamato polity's relationship with iron. The bronze mirror is romantic. The bronze mirror has the specific, warm, ceremonial beauty of an object that was made to be seen and held and understood as the material embodiment of a spiritual and political relationship. The iron is different. The iron is not for looking at. The iron is for using. And what it is used for in the Middle Kofun period is the unglamorous, entirely practical, absolutely essential work of cutting and digging and fighting and building that constitutes the material foundation of a political system's daily operation. The plough that turns the paddy field deeper than the stone mattock could turn it. The axe that clears the hillside for the new settlement. The sword that is carried by the mounted warrior whose presence in the provincial landscape is the physical, material, entirely undeniable reminder of what the centre can send if the tributary relationship requires enforcement. The armour that protects the body of the soldier who carries the sword. the horse fittings that make the horse useful for the specific military and ceremonial purposes that the middle Kofun elite requires. All of it iron. All of it arriving, ultimately, from the same source. The continental supply chain that connects the Yamato polity to the iron deposits of the Korean peninsula and the processing technology of the continental smiths. Thud. The forge. A different sound from the mallet. Sharper. More deliberate. He understands iron the way he understands everything. As a system. Not the metallurgy, not the specific technical details of the forging process that the smiths carry in their hands and their eyes, and the accumulated muscle memory of decades of practice. The system. The supply chain that brings the raw material from the peninsula to the archipelago. The distribution network that moves the processed iron from the smithing centers to the communities that need it. The administrative capability to track and manage the flow of a resource that is, in the 5th century Yamato polity, as strategically significant as any single element of the political economy. Iron is power. Not metaphorically, literally. The community with iron tools has a productive advantage over the community without them that compounds, season by season, into a material difference so large that the political consequences of it eventually become unavoidable. The chief with iron weapons has a military capability that the chief with stone and wood weapons cannot match, regardless of the number of warriors available. The center with reliable access to the iron supply chain has a leverage over the network that no spiritual authority, however genuine, can replicate. He has been thinking about this leverage since before he was king, since the corridors, reading the map of the palace's political dynamics, since the early morning room, receiving the information beneath the information about the state of the network. The iron supply chain is one of the most important structural facts of the Yamato polity's political economy, and the most important structural fact about the iron supply chain is that it is not entirely under the center's control. Inhale, and the vulnerability settles into the awareness. Exhale, and the problem forms. The iron comes from the peninsula. This is not a problem in itself. The Western Road has been carrying iron to the archipelago for generations, and will continue to do so as long as the relationships that maintain the road are maintained. But the relationships are maintained by the peninsular kingdoms, not by the Yamato. Baekje, Silla. The kingdoms whose territorial control over the iron deposits and the processing centers gives them a leverage over the supply chain that the Yamato's diplomatic correspondence can influence but cannot determine. This is the vulnerability. The specific, structural, entirely practical vulnerability of a political system whose material foundation depends on a supply chain that runs through the territory of powers the Yamato does not control. The vulnerability that the diplomatic letters to the Liu Song are partly intended to address, by using the continental recognition to shape the political environment in which the peninsular relationships operate. The vulnerability that the military preparation is intended to address more directly. But before the military approach, before the diplomatic approach, there is a third approach. More patient, more structural, less dramatic. The approach of someone who understands that the most sustainable solution to a supply chain vulnerability is not to fight over the supply chain, but to build a different relationship with it. Scuff. The smithing center at the edge of the settlement. He visits the smiths, not the ceremonial visit of a king inspecting the productive capacity of his network. The specific, unglamorous, ink-on-the-hands visit of a person who wants to understand something from the inside. He sits with the head smith, the continental immigrant whose forging knowledge is the most advanced available in the archipelago. And he asks questions. Not diplomatic questions, technical ones. What determines the quality of the bloom? Where the process is most vulnerable to variation? What the limiting factors are in scaling the production? The smith is surprised, and then not surprised. He has been in this court long enough to have encountered the king's specific quality of attention in other contexts, and to have learned, through that encounter, that the questions are genuine, and the listening is real, and the understanding being built is not the performed understanding of a king maintaining the appearance of engagement, but the actual understanding of a person who wants to know. He answers completely, without the diplomatic compression that information always undergoes when it travels from the technical expert to the political authority. In the full, specific, technical detail of the actual situation. Inhale, and the technical reality settles. Exhale, and the system reveals itself. The processing technology can be developed locally. This is the central fact that emerges from the conversation with the smith. The technique of the continental forging tradition, which the first-generation immigrants brought to the archipelago in their hands and their eyes and their muscle memory, can be transmitted to the second generation, to the apprentices who have been working alongside the continental masters in the smithing centres, to the local craftspeople who have been absorbing the technique through the proximity of practice that the mixed workshops provide. The transmission is already happening. Not completely, not yet at the level where the locally trained smiths can produce the full range of work that the continental masters produce, but far enough along that the capability is developing, that the archipelago is building, in its smithing centres, a local iron processing capability that will reduce, over time, the degree to which the quality of the output depends on the continued presence of the continental masters. The raw material still comes from the peninsula. That dependency cannot be eliminated by developing the processing capability. But the processing dependency can be reduced, and reducing the processing dependency is the first step toward the more sustainable relationship with the iron supply chain that the polity's long-term stability requires. He files this away. In the specific, organized, entirely practical way, he files everything. As one element in the larger picture of the network's resource dependencies. As one piece of the administrative infrastructure that needs to be developed. As one aspect of the unglamorous, patient, entirely essential work of building a political system that can sustain itself at the scale it is trying to reach. The iron is not romantic, but it is necessary. And the person who understands the system behind it has a capability that the person who only sees the sword does not. The sword from the Inariyama mound sits in the scholar's room for several days before he is ready to discuss it. Not the actual sword, which is in the burial chamber of the Kanto mound, sealed and dark, and 16 centuries away from the excavation that will bring it back to the light. The information about the sword. The report from the provincial administration of the Eastern Network, delivered through the channels that the administrative development of the reign has made possible, describing the burial and the inscription and the specific political significance of a retainer choosing to mark his burial iron with the name of the king. He reads the report in the specific, unhurried way he reads everything, without the urgency that the significance might seem to demand, allowing the full weight of it to settle before he begins to assess it. The name is there, his name, in the iron of a burial sword on the Kanto plain, in the formal, continental script that the scholar's transmission has made available to the provincial administration of the Eastern Network, in the specific, personal, entirely voluntary declaration of a retainer who understood his relationship to the king as the defining fact of his identity, and chose to say so in the most permanent medium available. Scuff, the scholar's room, ink and cedar, and the weight of the inscription. He has known, in the abstract, that his name was in the iron. The administrative records of the network, developing as they are with the writing system's transmission, have been tracking the distribution of the king's authority through the formal channels of the tributary system. But the formal channels are formal. They record the obligations and the acknowledgements of the tributary relationship in the specific, impersonal, administrative vocabulary of a system that is concerned with the fact of the relationship rather than with its quality. The inscription is different. The inscription is personal. It does not record an obligation. It records an identity. The specific, individual, entirely voluntary declaration of a person who was part of the network and who understood their place in it not as a burden to be managed, but as a fact to be claimed, as something worth inscribing, worth placing in the dark, worth trusting the centuries to preserve. Inhale, and the inscription settles into something other than policy. Exhale, and the human fact of it breathes. He thinks about the retainer, not the political significance of the retainer, which is substantial, which is the confirmation of the network's real extent, and the proof that the Yamato's authority is understood as such at the distance of the Kanto plain. The person, the specific, individual, entirely particular person who lived on the Kanto plain in the 5th century and served in the Yamato network, and understood that service as the central fact of who they were. He knows people like this. He has been building relationships with people like this for his entire reign. The officials who deliver their accurate reports, the craftspeople who produce their best work, the scholars who transmit their knowledge completely, the people in the early morning room, the ones who give what they have rather than what they calculate is sufficient. These are the people the network runs on, not the tributary chiefs, who are necessary, but whose relationship to the center is always partly the calculation of costs and benefits. The people whose relationship to the center is not primarily a calculation, whose identification with the network is genuine enough that they would inscribe it on iron and place it in the dark. He puts the report down. He sits for a moment in the specific, quiet, cedar-scented air of the scholar's room. He breathes. Then he picks up the brush. He writes in the specific, halting, learning as he goes way that he writes in the continental script that is still not entirely natural to his hand, a short document. Not a formal administrative record, something more personal than that. A note to the provincial administrator of the Eastern Network, acknowledging the report and requesting that the information about the burial and its inscription be preserved in the administrative record with the full detail of its content. Not because the administrative record requires it, because the person who made the inscription deserves to be recorded accurately. Because the identity they claimed, in iron, in the dark, trusting the centuries, is an identity worth acknowledging. In writing, in the permanent record. One inscription answering another, across the distance between the center and the edge of the world the center encompasses. Thud, thud, thud. The network confirmed in both directions. The Eta Funiyama sword is still in its burial chamber in the Kumamoto Basin. The report about it has not yet arrived. That confirmation will come later. But the pattern is already forming in the administrative record that is developing in the scholars' room and the early morning room and the formal channels of the tributary correspondence. The name is in the iron at the eastern end of the network. The pattern suggests it is in the iron at the western end as well. The network is real. Its reality is being confirmed not just by the formal tributary record, but by the personal declarations of the people within it. He is not sentimental about this. Sentimentality is not a mode he inhabits comfortably, but he is not unmoved by it either. The person who learned to read the palace in the dark, who learned the map of the footsteps, who has been reading people since before he could name what reading was, understands what it means for someone to choose a relationship as the defining statement of who they are. He knows what it costs to make that choice. He has been making versions of it since the board began to clear. The choice to be the center rather than the shadow. The choice to be large rather than small. The choice to carry the name that the iron on the Kanto plain is carrying, in the full weight of what that name implies. The iron network is real. His name is in it. And the person who put it there understood something about him that the chronicles, with their careful language, do not quite capture. That he was worth the inscription. The sword is the visible part. This is the thing about the iron network that the chronicles miss, because the chronicles record the visible parts. The sword in the burial chamber. The warrior on the horse. The military campaign that enforces the tributary obligation. These are the things that produce events, and the chronicles record events. What the chronicles do not record is the system behind the sword, the administrative infrastructure that makes the sword possible, the supply chain that delivers the iron from the peninsula to the smithing centers of the archipelago, the distribution network that moves the processed iron from the smithing centers to the provincial administrations that need it, the record-keeping system that tracks the flow and ensures that the iron that reaches the tributary chief who needs a sword is the iron that was intended for that purpose, and not iron that was diverted somewhere along the chain. The system is not glamorous. The system is the opposite of glamorous. The system is the accounting records and the distribution documents and the administrative correspondence between the smithing centres and the provincial administrators and the central office that coordinates both. The system is the unglamorous, patient, entirely essential infrastructure that makes the sword available when the sword is needed, and the plough available when the plough is needed, and the armour available when the armour is needed. He is building this system. In the scholars' room and the early morning room and the formal channels of the administration that the writing system's transmission is making possible. One document at a time. One administrative record at a time. One piece of the infrastructure at a time. Scuff, the administrative morning. Documents and brushes and the smell of ink. The provincial administrators are receiving, in the middle years of his reign, a different quality of communication from the centre than they received in the earlier years. Not just the formal tributary correspondence that the oral administration of the earlier period produced. Documents, specific, written, permanent documents that record the obligations and the allocations and the administrative decisions of the centre in a form that can be consulted, referenced, disputed, and appealed to. This changes the relationship, not dramatically, in the specific, structural, entirely practical way that the introduction of a documentary record always changes the relationship between an administrative centre and its periphery. The provincial administrator who previously operated in the space of the oral record, where the interpretation of an obligation could be negotiated in the specific, contextual way of people whose understanding of the obligation exists only in their memory, now operates in the space of the written record, where the obligation is what the document says it is, where the negotiation happens before the document is written, not after. Inhale, and the administration tightens. Exhale, and the system clarifies. He is aware of the resistance this produces. The provincial administrators who have been operating in the oral tradition for generations, who have developed the specific, sophisticated, entirely practical capability of managing their obligations in the flexible space of the oral record, are not universally enthusiastic about the introduction of the documentary record. The document is less flexible than the memory. The document does not forget. The document does not allow the kind of contextual interpretation that the oral tradition permitted. Some of them push back, not dramatically, in the specific, distributed, individually reasonable seeming ways that resistance to administrative change always manifests. The document that arrives slightly incomplete. The record that is kept in a format that is technically compliant but practically difficult to use. The interpretation of an obligation that is formally correct but substantively evasive. He deals with this the way he deals with everything, with patience up to the point where patience is no longer serving the purpose, and then with the specific, targeted, entirely unambiguous attention of a king who has been reading political systems since childhood, and who knows the difference between the resistance that is about the document and the resistance that is about the underlying relationship. The resistance that is about the document he accommodates. The transition to the documentary record is not simple. The provincial administrators are not scholars. The writing system is new to many of them. The practical difficulties of implementing a documentary administration in a province that has been operating orally for generations are real and deserve patient management, rather than the architecture of fear. The resistance that is about the underlying relationship, he does not accommodate. The provincial administrator whose resistance to the documentary record is the expression of a reluctance to have their tributary obligations specified with the precision that the document provides, is the administrator whose underlying relationship with the center requires the specific, clarifying attention of the early morning room. Thud. 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 The system building itself into the network. By the middle years of the reign, the iron network has a different character from the iron network of the early period. The supply chain is more documented. The distribution is more tracked. The administrative correspondence between the smithing centres and the provincial administrators and the central coordination is more developed. The system behind the sword is more visible in the administrative record than it has ever been. This does not make the sword less necessary. The sword is still the sword. The fear is still part of the architecture. The military capability that projects the centre's authority into the provincial landscape is still the material foundation of the tributary relationship's enforceability. But the sword now has a system behind it, a documented, administrative, record-keeping system that tracks the flow of the iron and the obligations of the network and the performance of the provincial administration with a precision that the oral tradition could not achieve. A system that makes the sword more effective by making it more rarely necessary. Because the network that knows its obligations are documented and tracked, and that the centre has the administrative capability to verify their fulfillment, is a network that is more likely to fulfill them without requiring the sword to make the point. The iron network is not just the iron. It is the system that puts the iron where it needs to be, when it needs to be there, in the quantity required, tracked and recorded, and administratively managed with the specific, unglamorous, entirely essential precision of a political system that has decided to become more than the sum of its tributary relationships. It is becoming a state, one administrative record at a time, one document at a time, one piece of the unglamorous infrastructure at a time. The sword is in the burial chamber on the Kanto plain. The name is in the iron. And behind the name, behind the sword, behind the burial chamber and the mound above it, the system, patient, documented, building itself into the fabric of the network, one record at a time. Good night. Just breathe. The administrative records are in their cedar boxes. The smithing fires are banked for the night. The iron is where it needs to be. And the system is continuing in the quiet, unglamorous, entirely reliable way of systems that have been built correctly to do what it was built to do.